My ex-husband committed suicide. After his death, I accidentally found his diary, and only then did I learn the truth behind our divorce. It turns out there was no third party, no affair, only his shattered and brief life. By a twist of fate, I went back 15 years and met 11-year-old Edward again. When there was still time, I chose to stand in front of him, weak and helpless, and told him, "Don't be afraid, I'll protect you." Chapter 1. Less than a year after our divorce, my ex-husband Edward committed suicide. I received a call from the police back home. The person on the other end said he was a police officer. He said Edward was dead. He jumped into the sea and took his own life, asking me to come back home to claim his body. Jumped into the sea and committed suicide. How is that possible? I taught him how to swim, not to mention, he transferred alimony into my account just yesterday. He's gone after just one day? Thinking it was some international prank, I retorted, isn't he married again? Why wouldn't he contact his current wife, but instead contact me, his ex-wife? After confirming his identity and police badge number, the voice on the other end said, Edward has not remarried. You are the only contact we could find for Edward. Realizing it was true, tears streamed down my face, as if I had been struck by lightning. After that, I couldn't hear what the police said anymore. Edward and I were married for 4 years. After I found out about his affair, we divorced amicably. He wanted to leave with nothing, but I refused, leaving him the house and taking only half of the savings before going abroad. Besides sending me his salary every month, we had no contact. I rushed back home by plane that night, only to see a giant, unrecognizable Edward, swollen and disfigured by the sea, barely recognizable except for our wedding ring on his finger. After burying Edward, his lawyer Oscar found me and handed me the cat that Edward had raised. This cat, named Ned, was a birthday gift I gave to him on his 21st birthday. Before his suicide, Edward asked Oscar to take care of the cat for a few days. Ned doesn't know, its owner is no longer here. Oscar said that Edward left me a house and $730,000 in savings, as compensation. This was almost everything he had. Chapter 2. I asked Oscar, why did Edward commit suicide? Oscar said, separation and transformation disorder, long-term accumulated depression out of control. I didn't believe it. Edward was so rational, what could have pushed him step by step towards death? Oscar's expression turned serious. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I believe you have the right to know the truth. He handed me a USB drive. You may not be aware while living abroad, but the videos inside this USB drive have been maliciously spread online in the past year. They even posted it on the university forum where Professor Edward worked, causing him to lose his job. Later, the separation and transformation disorder relapsed, which might have been one of the reasons Professor Edward committed suicide. The USB drive contained hundreds of videos showing 12-year-old Edward being violated and abused, in a state of almost complete despair and helplessness. Just one video made me feel unbearable agony. A deep sense of powerlessness spread throughout my body, as if countless needles were piercing me violently, causing intense pain in my organs. I can't believe that my beloved husband has been treated so cruelly. How much pain he must have endured. With a trembling voice, I pointed at the abuser in the video and asked Oscar, who was he? Did he also spread the video? Oscar replied, his name is Larry, he is Edward's stepfather. After Edward's mother passed away from cancer, he started abusing Edward for a year, then threw him into an orphanage and used these videos to threaten Edward, demanding a large amount of money from him every year. Until a year ago, Larry, in debt from gambling, demanded $2 million from Edward. When Edward refused, Larry, embarrassed and angry, posted the video online and escaped abroad, still not caught. I listened silently, heartbroken. He had endured so much alone, without me knowing. Later, I found Edward's diary, filled with accounts of his torment day and night, and countless inescapable nightmares. His parents, teachers, classmates, friends. No one had treated him kindly. Their abuse became a lifelong shadow for Edward. Yet, he saw me as the only brightness in his bleak life, his final straw of hope. His short 26 years came to an abrupt end. He said, I am finally free. He said, the only one I'm sorry for is my wife. Tears streamed down my face as I read through all the diaries. I should have noticed earlier, I should not have let him face all this alone. Chapter 3. Our wedding photo still hung on the wall in the room, his lips slightly curled as he looked at me. Suddenly, I remembered the year in college when I pursued him fiercely, the second year when we sat by the window in the library corner. He read, I watched him. He raised his eyes to look at me, his voice soft and bitter. Kathy, am I really worth your affection? You don't know me. And how did I respond back then? I leaned in close to him, whispered in his ear, of course, you are worth it. You deserve the best in this world. His face slightly flushed, his pale lips turning slightly red from his bite. He looked deeply into my eyes, as if making a big decision. Kathy, I agree. Lost in his beautiful amber eyes, I asked, agree to what? Before I could finish, I was almost jumping with joy. Really? His long hand covered my mouth, afraid I would run around the library in excitement. Pushing his hand away, I kissed his lips. His face blushed to the roots of his ears, as if blood could drip out. Proudly, I kissed his face again. You are my boyfriend now, why are you afraid of a kiss? I thought I was the passive one in our relationship. But in his diary, he wrote, Kathy, it's good that you came. I walked alone, thinking I would forever be in darkness. Then you came with a light, wanting to hold my hand and walk towards a brighter place. Every moment with you felt like stolen time, so I tread carefully, afraid you wouldn't love me, afraid you would love me too much, afraid you would know about my broken past, afraid you would leave me. I hugged the diary, crying. Even the infidelity I thought of was just a silly plan he came up with to divorce me. Chapter 4. I kept reading Edward's diary, detailing his life, over and over, until I fell into a deep sleep. A voice in my dream asked, do you want to see him again? Yes, I do. Then my consciousness suddenly became clear. When I opened my eyes again, I was back 15 years ago. At that time, I was 12 years old, and he was 11, everything was still salvageable. Originally, I was supposed to transfer schools during the second semester of my senior year in high school at the age of 17, becoming Edward's desk mate at the new school. But now, time had to be advanced. Upon my persistent request, my parents finally agreed to let me transfer to the middle school Edward attended, 5 years earlier than when we were supposed to meet. Enfang Middle School, Class 1 of the first year. I stood on the platform introducing myself to the whole class. My name is Kathy, I'm the new transfer student. However, my eyes kept searching among the students, finally spotting a small, dark and skinny child in the last row near the trash can, dressed in washed-out clothes. Compared to the other students, he looked like an ugly duckling, completely out of place. But I recognized him at a glance, it was little Edward. Tears welled up in my eyes, thinking I would never see him again. He was as thin as he was in his senior year, just not as dark and short back then. The teacher asked me to choose an empty seat to sit in, and I walked straight towards Edward, ignoring the gazes of others, and sat down next to him. He didn't look at me, just kept his head down searching through his drawer, but after a while, he didn't find anything. I knew he was avoiding me, he wasn't good at interacting with strangers. I greeted him, hello, I'm Kathy. And you? Only when he heard me speak did he stop his actions, timidly saying, Edward. Edward still didn't look at me and didn't want to say another word to me. I just stared at his legs, still thin as my arm, a boy of 11 with the size of an 8 or 9-year-old. His yellowing hair, slightly sunken cheeks, no matter how you looked at it, he looked malnourished. My heart ached just looking at him. Edward's biological father had passed away when he was 8 years old, and after that, he had been living with his remarried mother. His stepfather treated Edward as a burden, abusing and scolding him, and his mother never intervened. Sometimes they would fight, and both would take it out on Edward. After his mother passed away from cancer when he was 12, Edward was mistreated and bullied by his stepfather, eventually ending up in a welfare institution. All of this, I only found out from Edward's diary after his death. In front of me, he never mentioned his past. Now that I was back, Edward's life was just beginning, and I couldn't let him go down the same path. I had to make those who had mistreated Edward pay the price, find a way for my parents to adopt him before Edward's mother passed away, and completely change the suffocating life he described in his diary. Chapter 5. During breakfast time, everyone brought out their breakfast to eat. I opened the breakfast my mother had prepared for me, a box of sushi, 2 eggs, a carton of milk, 3 siumai, plus a Swiss roll. It had to be my mother, knowing exactly what I liked. Beside me, Edward took out a white plastic bag from his tattered school bag, containing only a small steamed bun, clearly not the school breakfast. In that despicable household, Edward had to work and serve them, yet he couldn't even eat a proper meal. It was no wonder that at his age of growth, Edward was still so skinny. Perhaps noticing I was looking at him, he used his arm to cover up the food. Breakfast with only a small steamed bun, no matter who it is, by the time school ends at noon, everyone would be starving. Thinking about this made me furious. I enthusiastically called out to the girls sitting in front of me, "This sushi was made by my mom, it tastes really good, try some." After giving each of them 2 pieces, I pushed the last 2 pieces of sushi in the box towards Edward. "Edward, try some, it's really delicious." Edward shook his head, "No need, I have food." He stubbornly turned his head towards the window. I pushed the box a bit closer to him, smiling, "I promise, it's really tasty, if I'm lying, I'm a puppy." Edward hesitated for a moment, but seeing the 2 girls in front eating naturally, he also picked up a piece of sushi and put it in his mouth. "Is it good?" Edward nodded, I still looked at him expectantly. "If it's good, have another piece." Edward picked up another piece and ate it. Although it took some effort, at least Edward finished 2 pieces of sushi, which could somewhat fill his stomach, but he still wasn't completely satisfied. I pointed to the steamed bun Edward was hiding with his hand. "Edward, I want to eat your bun." Edward looked at me somewhat puzzled, his eyes full of confusion. But when he thought about it, he had just eaten my sushi, and unable to refuse, he hesitantly said, "The bun is a bit hard." "It's okay, I have good teeth." I simply took it from the plastic bag, took a bite. Oh my goodness, it was really hard, cold and tough to chew. Unbelievable, even the bun was hard as a rock. Realizing Edward was staring at me, I pretended to be calm, with a straight face, eating the bun. While nibbling, I said, "It's okay, the bun is fine." After finally finishing the bun, I forcefully pushed the milk and eggs towards him. "I ate your breakfast, I'll give you the milk and eggs in exchange, no refusal allowed." I deliberately emphasized the last 4 words. Edward, afraid of upsetting me, finally accepted. Under my supervision, he managed to eat all the eggs and drink all the milk. These tactics, I learned from the 17-year-old Edward. At the beginning, he was unwilling to eat the breakfast I brought, unless I was sharing with many people, then he would reluctantly take a little. This trick really worked wonders on him. After finishing breakfast, he felt much better. Indeed, that listless appearance was due to hunger. I was determined to fatten Edward up. Chapter 6. Edward sat in the corner of the classroom, almost no one spoke to him throughout the day. I started to initiate conversations. "Edward, can I borrow your eraser?" "Edward, I'm feeling sleepy, wake me up if the teacher comes." Throughout a class, I could call Edward's name dozens of times, and during breaks, I would chat with him. He didn't get angry, just listened to me and handed me the eraser. When I napped in class, the teacher came and clumsily tugged at my sleeve, quietly telling me to wake up. In his diary, the 11-year-old Edward expressed his loneliness with a slightly skewed penmanship. "No one wants to be friends with me. I came, so I could be his friend." During break time after class, a few boys walked to the back of the classroom, holding drink bottles in their hands, standing 2 meters away, and started throwing the bottles into the trash can. As I returned from getting water outside, I saw a boy named Jason take a half-full bottle of water and slam it directly onto Edward, who was sleeping on the table, then quickly threw a second and third bottle. Bang! 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 The dull sound of heavy objects hitting flesh echoed in the classroom. Edward couldn't dodge in time, grimacing in pain, his face contorting. The group of boys started laughing. "We told you to throw it into the trash can, not at the trash itself, can't you do it?" Jason, with a mocking tone, told Edward, "The one next to the trash can, pick up the bottles and throw them in." Edward looked at the arrogant boys, then at the bottles next to the trash can, bent down, prepared to pick up the drink bottles that had been thrown at him and put them in the trash can. Seeing Jason and the other boys bullying Edward so skillfully, it was clear they often did this to him. I was furious. I picked up the water bottle in my hand, recently refilled, and fiercely slammed it towards Jason's back. Jason winced, turned around. Who did that? Who hit me? That hurts. You know it hurts too. If it hurts, why throw it at someone else? Jason, embarrassed and angry, tried to come towards me, but I firmly grabbed his hand, then gave him a big slap on the face and a shoulder throw that brought him down. At this age, girls are usually taller than boys, plus I had been practicing taekwondo since I was young, so knocking him down was easy. Jason fell to the ground, holding his hand, yelling in pain, "My hand, it's broken. Broken." I crouched down, took the hand he was holding. Even if it's broken, you still have to pick up the bottles you threw. Ah. Ouch. Let go. I'll pick them up. Can't I? Jason cried out in pain. Everyone in the class gathered around, watching as Jason awkwardly picked up the scattered drink bottles from the ground and threw them into the trash can. You can't even throw them in properly? Edward, seeing this scene, looked somewhat shocked. He probably didn't expect me to stand up for him. Jason was a bully who feared the strong. Unable to beat me, he cried and ran out. The boys who had surrounded the scene scattered, afraid they might be next. Edward picked up my water bottle from the ground, wiped it clean, and handed it to me, stuttering, "Your water bottle. He might go tell the teacher about you." "It's okay, I'm not afraid." "He picked on you first, I saw it all. Why did you help me?" Edward's words were barely audible and lacked confidence. He had been bullied for a long time, but no one had ever stood up for him. I looked at him seriously in the eyes. "Aren't we desk mates? It's only right for me to help you." "Edward, thank you." He said those two words very softly, barely audible, but I still heard them. I felt secretly pleased. The 11-year-old Edward was much closer to me than the 17-year-old Edward. That's good. Chapter 7. As expected, I was called out by the class teacher just before school ended. Edward looked at me with some concern, afraid I would be reprimanded for what happened earlier. I didn't care, and before leaving, I reassured him, "Don't worry, nothing will happen." Indeed, nothing happened. My parents may not have much else, but their ability to protect their child is top-notch. In the office, Jason, with several layers of bandages on his arm and a red handprint still visible on his face, was there with his parents, while my parents were called in hastily before the end of their workday. Seeing Jason like that, my mom grabbed my hand and whispered, "What grudge does he have, to end up with a dislocated hand and that big handprint on his face? You insisted on transferring here just to beat him up?" I was at a loss for words. Sure enough, my mom had a unique way of thinking. My dad, on the other hand, clearly stated that he would take care of all medical expenses and compensate for any mental distress. Upon hearing that my dad was willing to compensate for mental distress, the other parents' expressions softened slightly, but they still insisted that I publicly apologize, or else they would demand my expulsion from the school. Me, I won't apologize, but Jason must publicly apologize to Edward. He bullied a classmate, or else I'll call the police to handle it. My dad frowned upon hearing my words and then turned to look at Jason. I didn't. Jason began to argue with the teacher and parents. "It wasn't intentional, I just accidentally hit him while throwing the bottle into the trash can." Without saying a word, my dad requested the teacher to bring out the classroom surveillance footage. In the surveillance video, the seemingly harmless Jason revealed his true ugly side in front of Edward, bullying his classmates. The other parents' faces turned pale, cycling through different shades, as they hadn't expected their well-behaved child to be a bully at school. Realizing they were in the wrong, they dropped the demand for my apology. Jason was brought by his parents in front of Edward to apologize. Jason reluctantly bowed to Edward. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have bullied you, can you forgive me?" Everyone around, Jason, his parents, and the teacher, waited for Edward's response, their gazes not filled with goodwill, making it hard to breathe. Edward just stood there, moved his lips as if wanting to say something but didn't speak, his eyes showing a bit more stubbornness. Seeing Edward like that, I started to regret why I had put Edward in this situation, forcing him to forgive those who had bullied him. I stepped forward, took Edward's hand. If you don't want to forgive, we won't forgive, don't force yourself, he did wrong, it's all his own doing. Then I directly took him away, leaving those people standing there, exposed in front of everyone. Jason simply didn't deserve to be forgiven. Chapter 8. I led Edward to my parents and introduced him. Dad, Mom, this is my new friend I made today, his name is Edward. Edward was a bit surprised that no one had ever introduced him to their parents in such a formal manner before, especially as a friend. Hello, Aunt and Uncle, his voice was very low. Hey, Edward, nice to meet you. My mom was extremely enthusiastic about inviting all my friends over for dinner, so naturally, she started warmly inviting Edward, come over to Auntie's house this weekend, Auntie will make delicious food for you guys. My dad chimed in, yes, come over to our house and help Kathy study. Don't let her just play all day. Edward was a bit overwhelmed by my parents' warmth, but he politely responded, okay, Aunt and Uncle. It was perfect for me, as now I had an excuse to bring him home for dinner in the future and also help build a relationship with my parents beforehand. It was still about 3 months away from the time Larry would go after Edward, as mentioned in the diary, but I needed to plan ahead. After all, every second Edward spent by that demon's side was an added danger. After I taught Jason a lesson, nobody dared to bully Edward in class anymore. My relationship with Edward also grew closer. I started bringing an extra portion of breakfast every morning, pretending my mom had made too much and begged Edward to help me finish it. Unable to resist my pleading, Edward agreed to eat 1 bun for me every day but refused to have more. To ensure he ate enough, I asked my mom to switch the small vegetarian buns for large meat buns. When I heard his stomach growling during evening self-study, and him trying to hide it by drinking water, I would take him to the noodle shop near the school after class, saying I was too hungry and scared to eat alone at night. We ordered 2 bowls of beef noodles at the noodle shop, and he would always give in to my requests and eat with me. After dinner, he would silently follow me, even if it was out of his way, to walk me home until he saw me enter the house, then he would turn back. Sometimes the school would give out free meal tickets, and I always said I didn't like cafeteria food and gave them all to Edward so he could have a full lunch too. On weekends, I would bring him to my house to help me with my homework. My mom felt sorry for him and always made a table full of delicious food, insisting he stay for dinner. The 3 of us would eat together, and in a few moments, Edward's bowl would be full. Looking at the smile that occasionally appeared on Edward's face, I always thought, how wonderful it would be if time could just stop at this moment. Chapter 9. My fantasy was completely shattered when Edward stood in front of me at school with a long scar on his chin, a mark made by a sharp object, clearly not accidental. Who hit you? I asked him. No. Swear you're not lying to me. Edward remained silent, acknowledging that he was indeed hit by someone. It was your stepfather. He nodded. Suddenly, I remembered that after I started dating Edward, I had asked him how he got the scar on his chin. He had said it was from a childhood fall, which turned out to be a lie. The scar I had kissed countless times turned out to be a mark left by domestic violence. I couldn't bear to think that every kiss I gave him might have reminded him of those unbearable nightmares. Come with me to the hospital, I said, pulling Edward along. He sat upright in the chair, refusing to move. It's just a minor injury, it'll be fine in a few days. No, if we don't treat it, it will scar in the future, and I don't want you to be scarred, I said seriously. Seeing that he still wouldn't budge, I sighed, fine, you stay here, I'll be right back. I went to the infirmary to get medicine from the doctor and returned to help Edward with his wound. It might sting a bit, I'll do it quickly, I said as I used alcohol to clean his wound. The wound was deep, and using alcohol would definitely cause some pain, but he didn't flinch at all, though his eyes betrayed some hidden discomfort. My heart ached, tears threatened to spill from my eyes. Edward noticed and hurriedly reached out to wipe my tears. Are you crying for me? I nodded and carefully placed a band-aid over the wound. You need to take care of yourself. It seemed as if no one had ever cared for him like this before, Edward thought. He was momentarily stunned but then replied, okay. Chapter 10. One evening after self-study, I once again dragged him to dinner. As I was looking through the menu, trying to decide what dishes Edward liked, he suddenly asked, "Kathy, why are you so good to me?" I looked at him, slow to respond for a moment. Before I could figure out how to reply, he spoke again. "Is it because you pity me?" Edward's gaze fell on an elderly scavenger outside the window, begging passers-by for money. Outside, the old man was poorly dressed, his legs disabled, only able to sit on the ground. People passing by were in a hurry, only stopping after a long time to throw some change into the old man's bowl before quickly moving on. No one would know when the next person to stop for the old man would arrive. My heart skipped a beat as I followed Edward's gaze to the scavenger. My hand paused, and I spoke slowly, "No. Do I deserve you being so kind to me?" he asked again. In that moment, I almost shed tears. In a flash, I saw a young Edward in front of me, gradually merging with the love of my memory. I looked into his eyes earnestly and told him, "You deserve it. You deserve the best in this world. Will you always be my friend?" he asked cautiously, as if seeking reassurance. Confirming whether this time his long-held but unattainable love would truly fall on him, and not just be a dream or charity that would shatter upon waking up. "I will," I said with red eyes, my voice hoarse, "I will always be your friend." The tense look on Edward's face disappeared, replaced by an unprecedented sense of peace. The dark night that had shrouded him since his youth seemed to reveal a faint glimmer of light. Chapter 11. After some time living like this, he no longer looked as emaciated as when we first met. But he still looked worn out, often distracted in class, and his spirits were frequently low. I knew it was because he had to take care of his mother, Gloria, who was already in the late stages of liver cancer. Gloria's cancer was diagnosed a few months ago, with the tumor having spread throughout her liver, making it terminal. His stepfather Larry refused to spend money on a woman he deemed worthless, persuading Gloria to forego treatment just to leave money behind for Larry. Due to missing the window for optimal treatment, Gloria's condition remained unstable and continued to deteriorate, now reaching a critical point, with only Edward taking care of her. Even so, Gloria continued to scold Edward, venting all her anger on him, blaming him for all her misfortunes, never showing him even a bit of love. The thought of her impending death brought me a strange sense of pleasure. Someone like her simply didn't deserve to be a mother, let alone to live. With only 2 months left until her death, letting her die like this would be too easy for her. So, I chose the day noted in the diary when stepfather Larry took away all the money from the house. I sent the photos I had deliberately collected, showing Larry in bed with another woman, as well as records of Larry secretly transferring money to support a child with another woman, all in the name of Larry's mistress, sent all to Gloria, along with a message taunting her, "After you die, everything will belong to me and my son. You foolish woman, why aren't you dead yet? Let the waters stir even more, for a dog-eat-dog scene is quite a spectacle. I want her to die with 100-fold of pain and resentment." Chapter 12. But it was also the afternoon of sending those photos when Edward didn't come to school. I sat in the classroom, looking at the empty seat beside me, feeling anxious for no reason, starting to repeatedly recall the contents and details from Edward's diary. The diary clearly stated that when Edward returned home from school, he found out that Larry had taken Gloria's bank card and passbook while Edward was away. During the argument, Gloria's leg was injured by Larry. According to the diary, Edward should be at school right now. If he wasn't at school, then where could he be? Anxiety and fear surged through me. Why was it different this time? Why wasn't he at school this time? I couldn't think straight and hastily climbed over the school gate. With no cars on the road, I ran towards Edward's house like a madman, consumed by unknown fear, my inner panic reaching its peak. When I hurried to his house and entered through the half-open door, a man was crouched on the ground with his back to me, tightly strangling Gloria, who was struggling and almost subdued, her face turning red from lack of air. Under Larry's feet lay the motionless body of Edward. There was a wound on the back of Edward's head, blood flowing down his face, his head resting in a pool of bright red. My vision turned red. I picked up a bloodied hammer from the ground and swung it fiercely at Larry. Thud! A dull sound as he fell to the ground. Gloria finally freed herself from his grasp, gasping for air. My mind was a blur as I stumbled towards Edward, calling his name, but he showed no response. He was burning up, unconscious, blood gushing out of his hand uncontrollably, no matter how I tried to stop it. Trembling, I took out my phone, called an ambulance first, then the police. I shouted angrily at the woman who did this. Edward shielded me from Larry's attack with the hammer and the bottle. The woman, with disheveled hair, hoarsely cried out, if he hadn't protected me, he wouldn't have. I looked despairingly at Edward lying half dead in a pool of blood, crying out his name, wake up, Edward, Edward, Edward. Driven by hatred, I reached out, picked up the hammer from the ground again, ready to strike the man, but Gloria intercepted me, grabbing the hammer I intended to hit the man's head with. You can't kill him. He was just about to kill you and your son. I yelled at her, tears blurring my vision. First, save Edward. I looked at Edward. Yes, Edward, save Edward first, but the ambulance still hasn't arrived. Desperately, I lifted the bloodied Edward and rushed out the door. I carried Edward into the courtyard, and behind me, there was a huge explosion. A wave of heat surged towards me, and I realized what was happening, so I ran frantically out of the range of the heat wave. As I ran out of the yard, I turned back. The woman stood in the fire gradually being consumed, engulfing everything around her. In less than 10 seconds, the entire house turned into a blaze, flames soaring into the sky, consuming everything. I ran with Edward desperately towards an open space, never looking back. I collapsed in front of the arriving ambulance. Nurses quickly lifted Edward into the vehicle, and I followed. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to save Edward. Trembling, I took out my phone and called the fire department again. That woman was truly mad, just as mad as I was, no, even more so. Chapter 13. The nurses rushed Edward into the emergency room. I sat down, overwhelmed with the image of Edward covered in blood, the fear of losing him once again suffocating me. When I saw my parents rushing to the hospital, I finally broke down in tears, holding on to them. Mom, will Edward die? My mom touched my head. No, he won't. Edward is a good boy, he will be fine. Together, we anxiously waited outside. When the doctor came out, my dad hurriedly asked, Doctor, how is the child? Because he was brought in on time, he is out of danger now, the doctor said. Knowing Edward was safe, a huge weight lifted off my heart. Edward woke up in the early hours of the morning. Seeing me and my parents by his side, we were overjoyed to see him awake. For the first time, Edward felt grateful to be alive. Still shaken, I asked Edward, at that time, weren't you supposed to be at school? Why were you still at home? I went back to get the jade pendant my father left me. He said it was for the most important person. I wanted to give it to you, but I lost it, Edward replied weakly but earnestly. Tears streamed down my face as I took out a carved jade pendant from my pocket, trembling as I asked, Is this what you're talking about? It was the item he was holding tightly while unconscious, the same pendant he had given me before. I had always thought it was just a regular piece of jewelry, not realizing its significance. Edward nodded. Yes, that's it. It was all because of me that he got involved in this. I handed the pendant back to him. Important things should be kept safe. If you still think I'm important in the future, you can give it to me again. Edward accepted the item back. When the police came to the hospital to take our statements, I found out. When the emergency services arrived at the scene, the fire was intense. Firefighters rushed in to rescue people and found the woman inside had committed suicide in the kitchen, burnt to a crisp, while the man inside was burned alive in a horrific manner. I thought of Gloria. What was she thinking when she led Larry to his death? Did she regret it in that moment, not having treated her own son well? I will never know. But the fire she started led to Edward's rebirth from the flames. After Edward fully recovered, with his consent, my dad moved us away, completely leaving this city behind. Everything finally came to a complete end. Chapter 14. It took me a long time and a lot of effort to help Edward move on from his past shadows. My parents have always been good at raising children. They have so much love and respect to give, they spared no effort in caring for Edward, to the point where sometimes I wondered who their real child truly was. So Edward also grew up in love. We grew up together, almost inseparable, experiencing every important stage of life together. I am grateful to have reunited with Edward once again, witnessing him embark on a completely different life. For example, due to my mom's careful nurturing over the years, the previous Edward, who was only 178 centimeters tall, shot up to 190 centimeters in this life, becoming an unattainable figure for me. He was free-spirited, vibrant, and with his naturally sharp mind, no matter where he was placed, he was the most dazzling presence in the crowd. My parents were happy to send us to experience and learn various skills. So, Edward learned basketball, archery, boxing, martial arts, piano, violin, guitar, painting, rock climbing. He was talented in many ways, mastering everything, while I learned everything but excelled at nothing. With Edward's contrast, I finally became a useless waste. Just like the last time, we fell in love during college. What was different this time was that he persistently pursued me, never giving up. After I finally agreed to be with him, he happily handed me the jade pendant. "Kathy, you are the most important person to me." He said that because of me, he finally fell in love with this world. I replied, "I came for you from the beginning."